you would usually be using implicit objects in your JSP page when there is some kind of communication required in your application, right? So this could be a communication between the client and your JSP page. It could be communication between the servlet which sent the request to your JSP page and your JSP page, or it could be communication between your JSP page and a number of other objects like servlets and JSPs. So here by communication I mean that there is some kind of data sharing which is required. So whenever there is some kind of data sharing required in your application, you are bound to use implicit objects in your JSPs. Okay, so let's take a small example where you in your servlets you query the database and get some results, and you want to show that results in the JSP page. So you can set that value in your JSP. You can set that value in your servlets and retrieve that value in your JSP using one of the implicit objects. Right? We are going to see how we are going to achieve that and what the different implicit objects we have which we can use in the JSPs. Right? So first of all, the question is, what is an implicit object? Right? An implicit object is a set of predefined objects readily available for use. Right? So let's talk in general Java terms. How do you create an object? So let's say if you have a class called person, how do you create an object of a person? So person is nothing but a class. So you say person p1 is equal to new person. So you make the use of new keyword to create a new object, right? So now p1 is nothing but a new object, and whenever you need to create a new object, you are going to use the keyword new and create an instance of that class, right? But in JSPs, all that initialization and construction of the object is already done for you, and the engine, the servlet engine, provides you the predefined objects, which is nothing but the implicit objects readily available to use, right? So you don't have to go and construct that object and initialize that object with whatever default values or initial values you want, but it is already available to you, right? And all you need to do is you just use that object as if it was already created for you, right? So these are the different implicit objects we have in JSPs. Out, which is nothing but an instance of JSP writer, request, response, session, config, application, page, and page context. So we are going to have a look at each of these implicit objects and see what they actually represent, which classes they represent, which instance of which classes they are, and how do you use it, right? Okay. So this is a basic example of how you can use a implicit object in your JSP page. So as you know that in JSP, whenever you want to write Java program or you want to put in a Java code, you use these scriptlets tags, right? So this is my simple JSP page where in the body of the JSP page I am using a scriptlet and I am checking whether the value of the attribute scope is equal to yes or not, right? And if it's equal to yes, I am printing request, or I am going to print session. So basically here, if you have a look, this request, out, and session which I am using are nothing but implicit objects. Okay, so you can see that there's nothing special about these implicit objects. The way you use it is nothing special. You use it as any other normal object. So you create an object of a class and you call the methods on that class. So there's nothing special in the way you use that, but the only thing is that you already have that available and it's predefined, right? So you don't have to really construct that object yourself and initialize that. So you can directly use this request object or session object or out object, right? And you can call the different methods on those objects. Okay, so the first implicit object we have is the out, right? So if we have a look at this previous example, we use the out object to print request and we use the out object to print the session here, right? So by now you would have guessed that an out object, implicit object, is nothing but an instance of JSP writer, right? So whenever you want to write any kind of statement onto the page, you are going to use the out implicit object, right? So you can also use expressions to display, right? So but the other alternative you have is using the out implicit object to display any kind of text on the JSP page, right? So we know that every JSP page in the end is converted into an HTML when it is rendered to the client, right? So a JSP is converted to a servlet, but ultimately when the page is rendered to the end client, it is nothing but an HTML page, right? Because your browser, your web browser can understand nothing but HTML, right? And you are going to send that HTML page to your web browser. Okay, so in simple HTML terms, when you want to display something on your page, how do you do that? You write that text, whatever you want to be displayed on, in the body element of the HTML, right? So similarly, this is the Java way of displaying text on a web page. So if there is something dynamic which needs to be displayed on your HTML page, you definitely cannot use simple HTML, right? Because HTML is static and not dynamic, right? And when you want something dynamic to be printed on the page, you can use the out implicit object, right? So that's about the out implicit object. The next implicit object is the request, right? So request is nothing but an instance of the HTTP servlet request. Okay, and you know that for every servlet, the HTTP request servlet and HTTP servlet response objects are passed by the container to every servlet, right? And since a JSP is nothing but a servlet in the end, you should have access to all the objects which you have in a servlet, right? For that reason, you have access to the HTTP request object in your JSPs, and you can access that using the implicit object request, and you use these attributes stored in the request object for display or basic validations in JSPs, right? So as we have discussed in the previous example, let's say that when the client makes a request to some particular application, the servlet get invokes first, right? And the servlet takes the help of some helper object, which is nothing but another Java class, and let's say that it is connecting to the database to get some values. Okay, and it connects to the database, fetches the value and assigns the value of a to 10. So it computes the value of a as 10, and it passes back the value of a to the servlet. Now how do you pass this information to the JSP to be displayed? Let's say that I want to display this value of a on the JSP page now, right? And how can I do that? I can do that using the request object, right? So in my servlet, I'm going to set the attribute a with the value of 10 with the request scope, right? And I forward that request to the JSP page. And now using the request at implicit object, I can say request.get attribute a and simply print that value in the JSP. So why did I use a request attribute here in this scenario? Because the only place where I'm concerned about the value of a is in this JSP place, in this JSP page, right? So I'm going to print the value of a in this particular JSP page, and after that I don't really care what the value of the JSP is, right? So for only this particular request, the value of a is valid for me, right? So for that reasons I'm using the request attribute here. Okay, and it's very important for you to understand at which level or at what scope you are going to set these attribute values in your application, because if you are setting it in at a request level, the value is only available for that particular request and it is discarded, it's not stored anywhere in the memory, right? But if you are not storing it, if you are not using the request and you're probably using the session or application, which we'll be discussing later, this value will be available even after this request is over, and unless you need this value throughout the application, you don't need to set it, right? Because you are simply wasting memory over there, right? So this is HTTP request or the request implicit object in your JSP. So similarly, as you have the request implicit object in JSP, you also have access to the instance of HTTP servlet response in your JSPs, and that is through the response implicit object. Okay, and basically the response implicit object is used to send the response back to the client. right? And we know that most of the times the response you send back to the client is nothing but an HTML page. But we also know that apart from HTML, there are a lot of other types of files which you can send back to a client. You can send a jar file to a client, you can send an Excel spreadsheet to a client, you can send an image, you can send a movie, and a lot of other things, right? And in order to send all these different types of files to the end client, you should use the response implicit object, right? Okay, so basically when you are sending these different type of files to the client, you are going to set the MIME type first thing in your response, right? So by default the MIME type is nothing but HTML, but if you want to send an jar file, you are going to change the MIME type. If you want to send a movie file, you are going to change the MIME type, right? And you send the appropriate response in the response object. Okay, so one thing we need to discuss about response object is the use of send redirect. Okay, so while discussing servlets, we came across the use of request dispatcher, right? And we said that when a particular servlet in your application cannot serve the request anymore, it can send the request to some other servlet, right, which can handle that request. In a similar manner, even from a JSP, you can send that request to some other JSP page or some other servlet which can handle that request. Okay, so let's say you have a page where you have a shopping cart web page in your application, right? And you have changed the way you want to display that shopping cart application, and you have changed a lot of things around that, and you have also changed the JSP page for your shopping cart, right? And it's in a new JSP page now. So whenever people come back to that old URL for shopping cart, they wouldn't see anything in that page, right? Because you have moved everything to a new page, and you want to redirect your clients to the new page, right? In that case, you can use response object and pass that new URL to the send redirect method, right? So when you are using send redirect, you are actually sending the request back to the client. Okay, in the case of request dispatcher, you are not sending the request back to the client, and here client is nothing but the browser but not the end client. Okay, so what happens is, let's discuss these two examples. You have a request dispatcher and you have send redirect. Okay, in request dispatcher, when servlet 1 cannot serve the request, it's directly going to forward that request to servlet 2 without any kind of interruption or without sending back that request to the client. But when you're using send redirect, when JSP 1 cannot serve the request, it's going to send the response back to the client, which is nothing but the browser. Okay, and it's going to say, I cannot serve this request, but I know that this particular URL, this guy, this JSP can serve your request. Please make a request again to this new URL, and your browser is now going to make a second request to this new URL, and the new JSP is displayed to the end user. Okay, so from an end user perspective, using request dispatch or send redirect doesn't really make any sense, because all he sees is a new page, right? He doesn't know what internally happened, whether the application sent back the response to the browser or it directly forwarded the request to the new page. He really doesn't know, right? So that's the difference between send redirect and request dispatcher. And basically you can, when you're using send redirect, you can redirect the page to a completely different application which is outside your application, right? So you can send a request from Yahoo to Google, okay, because there's nothing but a URL, right? But when you're using request dispatcher, you can only send the request to, you can only forward that request to another page within your same application, right? So that's about the response implicit object. Next, session. So when we talked about data sharing in request, we said that since this value of A is only being used in this JSP and nowhere else, I'm going to set this attribute A at the request scope. Okay, so now let's say that I want that value of A to be printed multiple times in different JSP pages in my application. Okay, or let's say that it's username which is now to be printed and not the value of A. Okay, so when the user logs into the system, on each and every page I want to display the username on the right hand top of the page, right? So here the user makes request 1, my application sends back a response, the user makes another request, my application sends back another response. So this can happen a number of times, right? So you are constantly communicating with the user between different requests, right? And we know that since HTTP is a stateless protocol, so HTTP doesn't really understand or doesn't really know if one particular request is coming from the same user or different user. It treats every new request as a completely different request, and it's not able to differentiate between different requests whether it's coming from the same user or not, right? But when you are using session tracking in your application, you will have the ability to track the request, and you will have the ability to determine whether a particular request is coming from the same client or a different client, right? And we've talked about this in the servlet session, right? So here, when you want to share a particular data or particular information across multiple pages for the same client, so when the same client sends multiple requests, it's nothing but a session. So n number of requests in response from the same client is nothing but one session, right? And you want some kind of data to be persistent across multiple requests for that same client, you save that value in the session object. Okay, so in this case I'm going to save the value in session object. I'm going to save the username at the session level, at the session scope, and not the request scope. Okay, and I'm going to forward that request to this JSP, where again I'll retrieve it using the session implicit object and display that on the page, right? So now we have config and application, right? So config is nothing but instance of servlet config, and application is nothing but instance of servlet context. So we know that when something needs to be shared across the same JSP page, you use the config object, and when you have something that has to be shared across the whole application, you use the context object, right? So similarly you can use the config and application implicit objects. So this should actually be a small a and not a capital A. Okay, right? And this is definitely case sensitive. If you use capital A and you are trying to use the methods of the application implicit object, it won't return you any methods, right? Because it's an error there. You have to use the small a to retrieve the methods, to invoke the methods on the session context, the instance, right? Page is an instance of object, and you have one page implicit object for every page, every JSP page, right? So let's take the scenario where you have an application where on each and every page in your application you want to display some common text on the header and footer region, right? So instead of having that common text being present in each and every JSP page in your application, it would be a good design to have that common header and footer text in a different header.jsp and footer.jsp file, and you're going to add that header and footer in each and every page in the application, right? And here I'm using JSP include action to add the header and footer pages in my main page. So we are going to see what the different JSP actions we have in the future slides. So but now just make a note that you can use JSP include action to include a different JSP page in your JSP page. Okay, So ultimately, when the end user sees the page, he doesn't really know that the sources for all these, the source for the page is coming from different JSP files, right? All the user knows that is only one page in the end, right? So one of the advantages of using this kind of design is that if at all you want to make any kind of changes to either the header or footer regions, you don't really have to make changes in each and every page of your application, but it would be fine if you just make the change in one place, that is either the header.jsp or the footer.jsp. So I'm making change at one place as opposed to making change in thousands of pages, right? So here the header.jsp will have its own page attribute, its own page implicit object. The footer.jsp will have its own implicit object, and the rest of the main page will have its own page implicit object, right? And you needn't worry much about the page objects, because I don't think so you would rarely use the page objects in JSPs, okay, right? So finally we have page context. What is page context? So till now we have discussed all the different ways we can share data between these applications, between the JSP pages, right? So we know that the first is page at the page level, which only is restricted to that JSP page, not even the request, right? The next level we have is the request level, right? The next level we have is session level, which comprises of a number of requests, and ultimately we have application level, which is covered, which covers the whole application. So basically it covers all the JSP and servlets within the application. So here from bottom to top I'm going from least visible to most visible objects, right? And least visible in terms of scope, most visible in terms of scope, right? So let's say that in my servlet I store the value in the request object, right? But in the JSP I'm trying to retrieve that same attribute value from the session. Will I get that value if I try to retrieve, if I set it at request and try to retrieve at a session level in my JSP? No, right? Because if I set the value, attribute value at request level in my JSP as well, I have to retrieve that value at the request level. If I set it at request level, I have to retrieve at request level. If I set it at session level, I have to retrieve it at session level, right? I can't simply set at request and try to fetch the value from the session, right? So for that reasons, to avoid certain confusions, we have the page context implicit object, right? So it's a convenience object which we have in JSPs. So let's say that you save the value in request, and in JSP you don't really know whether you saved it at request or you saved it at session level, right? So you don't really know at which scope you saved that attribute value at. So when you use the page context, it basically tries to retrieve at the page level first. If it doesn't get at page level, it's going to check at the request level. If it doesn't get at the request level, it's going to check at session level. And now it doesn't get at session level as well, it's going to check at the application level. So basically when you use page context, it is going to check for each and every level, starting from least visible to the most visible level, right? And if at all there is a match found in any of the scopes, it's going to give you the value. So in this case you don't really have to worry in your JSP whether this particular attribute is set as session level or request level or not, right? So that's about page context and all the different implicit objects we have in JSP pages, right? Thanks.